Thank you again for everybody joining today. And we're all here to learn about Azure Migrate and what it does and the functions and features here. Before we jump in, let's talk a little bit about our agenda today. We have structured this session into some 6 key sections to give you a comprehensive view of the migration assessment process. First, we're going to discuss the value of Cloud Foundation and why it matters for your organization. And then we're going to go into addressing the core challenges that most organizations face when actually considering migration, which is often not surprisingly a technology problem, but more of an information problem. Next, we will dive into Azure Migrate itself, its purpose, its scope, followed by Greg Dodge doing a live demo so you can see the tool in action. After that, we're going to walk you through some cost estimates and how funding programs from Microsoft can actually offset your investment. And lastly, we will wrap up with the next steps and key takeaways that you can act on immediately following this webinar. So feel free to hold your questions to the end, or you can actually drop them into the chat as we go along. And then Rebecca will be collating those for the end of the conversation. So let's get started. This is a nice little eye chart here, but it really does give you some perspective on the difference between an environment without cloud and with cloud. With cloud, you don't actually have to prioritize one single business outcome over the other. There's an expression, you can have it all. And it's been our experience that it is true. And there's some key benefits that you want to focus on. The first is you can go from being reactive to more proactive in the security space, because there is security tooling that can keep eyes on and monitor your systems continuously and provide you recommendations. You also go from typically having an overabundance of resources to only paying for what you're actually using in more of a consumption model. You also go from situations where you typically will have downtime unless you have a very redundant, highly available environment, to an always-on system that has built-in resilience that you don't have to configure yourself. You go from a rigid system, typically, that includes physical hardware, to a more agile system that can actually scale as your organization grows at a moment's notice with a push of a button. You also get automation and AI to enhance and optimize your operations, which can improve the productivity of your employees and also just simply deliver a better experience for customers. So organizations are typically reconsidering their infrastructure strategy due to a convergence of several factors. They can be financial, operational, or in some cases, strategic pressures. One of the most common ones that we're seeing now is a change in virtualization licensing. And I can only assume that most of you know what I'm talking about when I say that, or the support models themselves. This can dramatically increase ongoing costs and introduce certain uncertainty into your long-term budgeting. If you're going through your VMware reline negotiations right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The other thing that we see is when we get to aging or end-of-life hardware being a major factor, and this is forcing IT leaders to choose between either costly refresh cycles that take a long time to plan and implement, or alternative platforms. So rising operational expenses, including power, cooling, maintenance contracts, staffing, and sometimes can further compound this issue. And additionally, many organizations lack clear visibility into how their infrastructure is actually being used, making it rather difficult to assess whether resources are oversized or they're misaligned with your business needs. These drivers often surface simultaneously, creating urgency, unfortunately, without clarity. So let's shift a little bit and talk about why these migration decisions stall. What we at ProArc really are asking teams to do here is shift how they think about migration. Traditionally, these decisions get framed as a technology problem. What moves, how does it move, and what platform to use? But that's actually not where most organizations get stuck in our experience. They get stuck because they don't fully trust the information that they have in front of them. So cost estimates are often based on spreadsheets or even worse, assumptions. Sizing can be based on peak activity instead of actual long-term usage. And risk is often driven more by fear of disruption than anything measurable. So the effect of this is decisions get slowed down. Stakeholders hesitate and alignment becomes rather difficult. So when you reframe this as a data problem instead, it does change the conversation. You're no longer debating opinions. You're looking at real usage, real performance, and real dependencies. That's where things like Azure Migrate comes in. It's not just another tool, but a way to bring clarity into your process. It gives you fact-based foundation so that your IT department, your finance department, and your leadership team can all operate from the same set of information. And that ultimately leads to better decisions and hopefully the faster progress as well. So what exactly is Azure Migrate? It's not new, no surprise there. It's been around quite a while. It has improved vastly from the early days, and you're going to see quite a bit of this today. And I'll be honest, it can be overwhelming at first, but it's better to have more data than less. So it's really a platform for migration discovery, migration assessment, and migration planning. But the key thing to realize is that what it actually means in practice. At a very high level, it helps us answer three fundamental questions. What do we have today? What would it look like if we moved it to Azure? And the really big one that everybody cares about, which is what's it going to cost? One of the most important things to clarify is that Azure Migrate is not prescriptive. And I think that's a big misunderstanding. It's not going to force you into a specific migration path or architecture. It gives you options, whether that's lift and shift as is, whether it's a phase migration, or whether it's selective modernization where you're going to re-architect, re-platform, or refactor your workloads. It's also not a commitment to migrate, which again, a lot of people get confused and they think if they set up Azure Migrate, that means I'm moving. If you use Azure Migrate purely for insight and planning, you don't have to take any immediate action. And from a risk perspective, this is designed to be extremely low impact. In many environments, many of you are probably running VMware, it is agentless and it does read-only discovery. This means that you can collect data that you need to without actually disrupting any of your production systems. So the key takeaway here is that Azure Migrate is about visibility and about clarity. It gives you the data and insights needed to make informed decisions before you commit any money or resources to that migration itself. So what does the assessment tell you? And again, assessment's just one piece of this. The first thing you get is readiness insights. It's going to help you quickly identify which workloads are ready to move right now with very little to no effort. They can move forward, and then also it's going to indicate to you which ones would need some level of attention. It starts by looking at and surfacing the dependencies between applications, between systems, and then indicating any blockers to you early on in the process. A second piece of this is right sizing. So instead of guessing what type of VM size you need in Azure, it's actually going to do performance testing to recommend the right fit. And this is really one of the biggest drivers around the cost optimization of Azure Migrate. I mentioned visibility already. So here's where you're going to see your estimated monthly costs based on how your environment actually runs today. Not theoretical models, not peak capacity planning, but based on the actual performance of those systems. And this, thankfully, gives you some confidence ratings. So it's going to tell you how much you can trust those results. We'd love to say you could get to 100%. That's just not realistic, but you can get pretty darn close. And if the rating is lower, what that indicates is you may need to gather more data before you actually make a final decision. Altogether, this shifts the conversation from can we migrate to here's what makes sense to migrate and why. So with that, I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Greg, who's going to talk to you exactly about how Azure Migrate actually works. Take it away, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Absolutely. The 3 steps of Azure Migrate are essentially the discovery, right? And you're going to want to do that for any number of 30 days or more. The longer, the better. You're also going to want to then do your assessment. And then in the assessment, you're going to modify some of the parameters and some of the things that go into that. And then from the assessment, you're then going to make business decisions and actually do a business case. So let's actually walk through that and look at what that looks like. So we've got a small environment here. We've set this up. Jim and I essentially have a small Hyper-V environment, and we set up an assessment by downloading an appliance. You put in some credentials into the appliance. Those credentials allow you to talk to the hypervisor, whether it's Hyper-V or VMware or even physical. And then at the same time, there's credentials for specific workloads, like you'll have the ability to use different credentials for web apps, different credentials for SQL Server, and those type things. And again, this is an agentless. You're not installing any agent on any of the machines being assessed. And our assessment just has 3 workloads, 3 servers, but we've got assessments with hundreds and hundreds of servers, and thousands isn't out of the picture. So it's a very scalable solution. Now, what the discovery essentially starts with is you download and install an appliance, which we did here, and you can see that it's registered and running. And then that goes off and starts pulling in the data. It starts making connections to all the different machines and reading information out of those machines. And that essentially generates what you see here. And we're not going to spend too much time in the discovery, but the idea is it's not always perfect. You can see here, I've got one workload. If I go into here, you can see that it's saying, hey, it couldn't connect to the server. The credentials were rejected. So we got to go back and fix the credentials. Pretty simple, right? So a little bit of remediation. Again, the longer that you let it run, the better you're going to get for performance data. Now, whether you build a business case first or the assessment first, tomato, it's not necessarily you have to do them in a specific order. I typically do an assessment first, and this is how you would create an assessment. You'd add the applications and workloads that were discovered during inventory. I'm going to go ahead and use one that I already have, just because it's already there. And essentially, you go through this, and it starts to use your assumptions that you programmed in. I'll show you in a second where you put your on-premises cost. But this is where it's saying, hey, what is the right way to move this? Now, keep in mind, you're going to have assessments of subsets, and you can choose different methods for different parts of your environment. So for instance, like a dev test environment might be just lift and shift, whereas you might look at a production environment using the PaaS preferred or the PaaS only approach. And so the idea here is, in our example here, it's saying how much it's going to cost. It's pretty much the same across all 3 workloads because it's a small environment. But the idea is it's actually pulling in real data and real performance. Like Jim said earlier, you can over provision in hypervisors. We've seen 16 processor, 128 gig of RAM. That's not true. The hypervisor's lying to you. That machine doesn't need that to run. And if you brought it over as is, your Azure spend would go through the roof, and that wouldn't be the way to do it. So you want to do an assessment, right? And again, there's different things that come out of this, different business, different information about them. It does a lot of things like, hey, is that a supported operating system? And is the machine ready to come over as is, or do you need to do some things to it to get it to move over? And then what about, this is the lift and shift, what about the situation doing a PaaS only, right? And we're looking at the PaaS approach. That's going to look a little bit different than the other. Now, we don't have a lot of data in here, a lot of servers, so you probably are looking at this going, wow, they all look very similar. And the idea is we just had a single server and a VM in there just to show this. But we're going to show you some other things in a little bit. The assessment also takes in some assumptions. If you're going to do this and you're going to do it right, especially for the business case, you want to make sure that in your assumptions, you've come in and you programmed in what your on-premises costs are, if that's important to you. If you're really interested in seeing what your ongoing on-premises costs are compared to that. So, what's your labor rate? What are you paying people? What are you spending on security today? So you want to dial this in. These numbers are not your numbers. They're very generic. So some of these are accurate, but some of them you're going to need to dial in to match your specific situation, right? Once you've got that in and you've got your assessment, you can then move to building a business case. Now, one of the other things in here is you can generate different ideas. You can generate different assessments. You can sit there and play with it. In the assessment, you can actually come in and tweak, where are you going? What type of an evaluation is? You can do an as is, don't recommend it, but because performance-based is best. What is the hit and what are you looking for percentile of utilization, right? For how long and confidence levels. And then do you have Azure hybrid benefit? Do you have any enterprise Linux? So you need to come in here on the actual assessment and make sure that you've dialed this in to what you're going to use, right? And again, you can actually clone assessments and come in here and tweak these and try different what if scenarios, right? And there's also, you can come in and say, hey, what type of machines am I going to allow? And what types of SQL Server? You got SQL Managed, SQL Azure. So you really need to spend some time with this. A lot of people maybe don't spend enough time here and configuring the actual assessment. And it basically it penalizes them somewhat, right? And again, you can come in here and change some of the assumptions. Spend the time to do this. This is probably easily more than 40, possibly 50% of your time is getting this right. Again, you can do this while the discovery's running. You have to wait. You can do it while things are running and you can dial it in, and then you can actually make multiple copies, multiple clones of that. So then once you get from assessment, now you're going to move into business case. Then again, some people start with the business case first, and then they move to the assessment. One thing I want to show is on your assessment, notice how it says performance coverage here. We had to reset the environment. We've not been running it that long. You do want that percentage, and I call it confidence level, but it's a percentage of how long you've been assessing the environment. You want to be in the 90th percentile. If you have time, letting it run to 100 is excellent, but you don't want to do it on 0. Because if you do a business case or any type of an assessment on 0, you don't have enough in there yet. So the idea is from an assessment or assessment plural, you can then build multiple business case. You'll notice that we've got one that's in here that says outdated. Outdated just means that particular business case needs to be refreshed. So if I go in here, I need to hit recompute, and it's going to go up and it's going to start recomputing that business case. And it even tells you, hey, this needs to be recomputed. It's going to go do that in the background. I'm going to show you one that we already finished computing. And again, these are estimated costs. Now, I showed you earlier where you put in your on-prem costs, but you also want to make sure that you dial in for the business case, your Azure costs, right? Is it a migrate or a modernize? What's the migration preference? Where are you going? And typically you can have multiple locations, but that's okay. Are you going to use RIs and Azure Savings in there for savings options? Some people just use RIs. What type of program? Are you on an enterprise agreement? Are you buying through a CSP with a Microsoft customer agreement? If you have multiple subscriptions, you can dial that in. If you're getting a discount from either Microsoft or us from a CSP, you can do that. And then you can dial in your comfort factor on how to do that. Now, if there's any questions on what any of these things mean, it's all hover over. So it's pretty straightforward on what these different knobs and levers do, okay? I'm going to go ahead and discard that because I don't want to change my business case. So if I come back to the business case and look at the overview, if you've got things right, these numbers should be pretty rational and they should be in more than just the ballpark. They should actually be on the pitcher's mound, right? They should be in good shape. Again, you're going to spend a lot of time tweaking all of the inputs and the assumptions and all the things that go into this, because if you don't, it's a garbage in, garbage out situation. You're not going to get really good data. In here, you can see how it's made the business case. It creates pretty graphs. Again, we have a small environment, so it's pretty small, but this would be over a year of moving these up. Now, why are these numbers so high? You might actually ask. Remember, earlier, our assessment that is being used by this business case is only at 0%. The longer it runs, the better these numbers get, and the more accurate these numbers get. So don't just create your assessment, do your inventory, create your assessment, and build a business case in one day. It's not going to be one of those things. You're going to have to be patient and wait for the data to come in. Now, you can do the assessment in the business case, but don't consider it ready to use until you get everything dialed in, right? This is a report that shows, hey, this is your current versus on-premises costs. It shows all your assumptions. It shows all the things that you put in there. They've also got some emissions reductions from what you're doing on-prem. Again, that's focused on very physical environments or even physical with a hypervisor. What type of migration strategies are you going to use? Now, keep in mind, we're just doing this on 2 machines and 2 workloads. But when you actually go to do it for real, you might break those up. And so you'll have an assessment for your dev environment and a separate assessment and a separate business case for your test environment, and then a separate one for your production environment. That's a good idea. Don't throw everything into one bag, because then you're mix and match. So for instance, dev and test environments, those are typically lift and shift, but you could actually do an assessment on your dev environment if it's a pretty good reflection of your test and prod, and do a modernize and see what that looks like. Again, the world is your oyster. You can do as many different assessment and business cases as you see fit, and that you need to be able to make your case. Because the idea is you want to be able to go to the business decision makers and have good numbers. Now, one thing that's new with the newer version is you can actually use Azure Arc to connect to all those machines while they're being assessed. And it'll actually factor that in. If you have workloads you are not going to move to Azure and you're going to keep those workloads on-prem, maybe they are TTL sensitive and they may suffer latency of being in the cloud because they have an on-prem dependency. Well, you can actually go and deploy Azure Arc and get that to all the machines. And then as you move machines to Azure, the Azure Arc is stripped off, but anything you leave back on premise still has Azure Arc. And that all factors into this, right? Because Azure Arc allows you to do on-premise management and at a pretty close to fixed price per machine. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, we've got all these reports and all these business cases. You also, if you're going to do multiple waves, you can come in and you can start your waves and you can lay those waves out. This is a simple environment, so we just did one wave, but you could have a dev wave, you could have a test wave, you could have a wave that's keyed into a specific application. So it's not that when you use Azure Migrate and you take all this time to do your assessments that you now, said, okay, it's an all or none, got to move everything. No, it is absolutely valid to move things in waves, and you might have things that don't move at all. So that's fully valid. I'm not going to go into migrations today, but the Azure Migrate, when you're done, it will actually use your assessments and your waves, and it will group things together so you can actually do that. You have to enable MSI to be able to do that. I'm not going to go into migrations today because that's further down the road. We're just talking today around discovery, assessment, and decisions, right? And deciding those 3 steps with Azure Migrate. Now, not to back up, but just to show you, if you have a lot of workloads that it's evaluating, they'll all show up here. And when you go into a particular workload, you'll be able to see a lot of information about that workload. In this particular instance, it's running a SQL DB, and there's 2 instances. They're not showing up here because it's still actually capturing data from it. So they're not showing up here, but they would, those DB instances. You can see here, this is not for the financial side of it, but this is for your IT folks. This is the digging in. This is getting into the gory details of everything. You can also use Azure Migrate. I've had people do that, where they actually use it to essentially do an inventory of everything on their machines and look for vulnerabilities. Show you in a second one of the reports around security that it generates. Again, we have these databases in here. These are actually software databases. This isn't the DB instances, but you get the gist. Every single workload you can go in and drill in, and then you can group those workloads together into waves, and the waves equal the groups. Again, this is our appliance that we downloaded. Takes 20, 30 minutes, maybe an hour tops if you lost your credentials and can't find them. This is an ERP server, and this is actually an Ubuntu Linux running. Assessments can be done on multiple platforms that are in the environment. It breaks it out into infrastructure and then databases and web apps. You can even see that you can see the software. Again, this is because it's actually talking to the to WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation. It's talking to each one of them. You can see what type of software is on each of the machines. I won't go into it too much today, but it'll actually understand applications And our environment isn't complex enough, but when you have a more complex environment, it can also identify the dependencies between workloads, between virtual machines, and even virtual machines that aren't being assessed. Like it'll show that there's a dependency to something outside of the environment that they can't see. Okay. You can actually go into your business cases and you can build them. I'm not going to go through and walk and build it. I'm going to grab this one again, because when you build it, it's pretty much this, and then it takes a few minutes to generate it. You'll notice that I can export this report here straight to Excel. Okay. And that right there is what I call the legacy reports. It looks like this. Yeah, it's got there's a lot of data in it. Okay, look at all my servers. Oh, look at all my disks. And here's the assessment properties that were used. That's useful, but that's what I call the legacy. You can still produce that today. That's not really the recommended approach. If you go through the 3-step process, and by the way, you can export the assessments. You can go into each one of those assessments and export a report for that. But because they have revitalized, is what I say, the Azure Migrate experience, they've actually created this reports down here where it'll actually generate the reports. And the reports are based upon the assessment and the business case. And these are much more useful, right? What am I talking about? Okay, so it's got this. Yep, there's a bunch of the software in the SQL Server. And oh, look at this. Here's all the software and all of the vulnerabilities, right? This is a .NET, lots of vulnerabilities in that version of .NET. We did that purposely. We did not update it because we wanted to generate data. But you can see here, it spits all that out. So you get some good spreadsheets. You can see here, this has all the assessment settings in it that you use to push into the assessment and the business case. And here's your pieces. This kind of looks like what I showed you before. Okay. And then it'll tell you whether the operating system it's running is mainstream or out of support. And then here's another report. This is some good stuff, and it's really in deep, but you're not going to sit here and walk through spreadsheets with your executive team. So the new reporting functionality, again, it's down here under reports preview, will generate PowerPoint. This is a PowerPoint. I have not edited this in one way, shape, or form. And this walks into the executive summary, what was discovered, what are the assessed inventory. Here's a little high-level security. I'll show you that they actually do that a little more in depth on the other side. But Microsoft's they've been saying for many years, everything needs to be secure when it comes over. So security is not something that we forego in an Azure Migrate. You need to identify your security risks so you can get those remediated beforehand, or use Azure to remediate them in some situations. If you can't use Azure or do something to remediate them on-prem. So, this has got all the finances in it. This is essentially untouched. You remember, based upon the assessment and the business case, we said which one we wanted to go with, and that's what it put into the environment, and it did the TCO. Now, everybody says TCO is a matter of show your work. Again, all of your work and your math is all in these things. So if somebody starts challenging you on what's in this PowerPoint, you can go back to that. But this is defendable, especially if you've done your homework. And you can see it brought in a lot of those things we saw in that business case that used to be in this old legacy one, didn't look this way. It actually has brought them in a much more robust fashion. Again, you get not just an Azure Migrate report, but you get a security report. You can combine these PowerPoints, present them separately, but you can see it's much more detailed in here, the deep dive into what security issues are on your workloads and what needs to be remediated, right? It's very specific. Again, we don't have a very complex environment, but we purposely use something that had a lot on it. We didn't patch it because we wanted to generate the data for you. These PowerPoints are all driven off of everything that comes out of the reporting engine. And when you do the reports, you get all of the background materials, the show your work materials. Okay. Now, what does that then translate into? At the end of the day, once you've made your business case on the financial summary and also, where we need to focus on security, and then you divvy things up into waves, you've managed all of your assumptions around Azure Hybrid Benefit and any reservations. The next step after all that is to then say, okay, let's go move some workloads. And the idea is you want to crawl, walk, run. Unless you're under some artificial date that is creeping up on you, you do not want to rush this process. And I won't go into the actual migrations because that takes a while to show, but the migration actually allows you to try before you buy. You can actually do a full trial cutover to the cloud into what I call a bubble that doesn't talk to anything. And you can go in there and you can have the folks that run those workloads, your ERP system, you can have them actually go in and validate that everything's working inside the bubble before you do it for real. Really good feature because that allows you to understand what it's going to look like when you do it for real. So again, just to summarize, the real key here is we're going to drill into a couple of more things here in a minute, but the real key is if you use Azure Migrate and you set up an appliance and you start assessing your physical or Hyper-V or VMware environment with this, you're going to get something like this. You're going to get issues that you need to go attend to, and you're going to need to let it run for a good period of time to get better and better data, especially around performance. And the idea is everything you need to know to understand this. And obviously, here's some stuff that helps you understand the different workloads. Now, one of the things that I glossed over is, Copilot? Yes. So there is an AI-assisted migration that is actually built into it now. So if you don't know and you need to go phone a friend and ask it to help you out, they do have an AI-assisted migration. Is that better than Jim or I? I don't know. That's debatable. It's going to be pretty good, but it's not going to have the experience of, say, past migrations. But it's going to help guide you if there are specific pieces of your migration that are complex or you're having some problems, or, hey, Copilot, go help me fix this workload needs attention. It's going to tell you, put in the right credentials, right? We put in the wrong credentials purposely so we can see that. All right. So we are now going to switch back off the demo and kind of wrap things up. Let me take off the share here and switch over here. Just takes me a brief second. I got to find and then share. There you go. Thank you very much. So again, the cost estimate that you get out of this, the business case, it's calculated, not assumed. And that's super important. If you do something based upon your current over provisioning or where hypervisors are lying to the workloads and giving them more capabilities than is actually needed, you don't want to do that. So you want to do it based upon real data. And then you're going to get run rates and what Azure is going to cost you based upon your purchasing of, say, the Azure Hybrid benefit, which requires software assurance. Or if you don't have software assurance, you can build all that in. But it's going to get, I've been really impressed with how close it gets. To be able to get funding from Microsoft, we actually have to take the Azure cost estimate. We have to plug everything into the Azure calculator and submit that to Microsoft to prove the workloads and what you're moving. And I'd say it's been more than the ballpark. It's definitely been, it's been really good. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about what funding opportunities are available. Microsoft does fund assessments and the planning and then the actual execution. And those could be different funding amounts depending upon where you're going through your process. And the amounts can range anywhere from $5,000 to do, say, a migration assessment up to $125,000. Now, what really drives that is the Azure consumption. So what we need to do to be able to go to Microsoft to get that is to do what? We need to run Azure Migrate. We need to do a discovery and at minimum an assessment. So we know what your projected costs are going to be in the general range, right? That doesn't have to be exact. So the amount of funding that you get is really depending upon the complexity, what type of workloads, and then the Azure spend. And then that allows us to go and do that. We can handle that process end to end. We don't have to go through anyone but Microsoft. We can work with them directly. And depending upon what your migration looks like, we can actually get some Microsoft resources also involved to do some architectural and some vetting and some rationalization and making sure that things look good. Okay. Next slide. So the assessment is where you start, discovery, assess, and start making decisions. You need to make sure that once you export all of this information, whether you do it all in Excel and you work on it yourself or you use the PowerPoints it generates and you tweak those, you're going to be walking in and presenting this to finance and maybe the CFO. So they're going to not really worry too much about workloads and what software you're running on. They're gonna look at the ROI, and they're gonna want you to be able to defend the ROI. That's all based upon what you put in. Now, once you do that, you can actually get some feedback from your stakeholders and say, okay, are we just gonna rip the Band-Aid off? Are we gonna phase it with waves? Are we gonna slow some stuff down and modernize that and move it to more of a PaaS service from a VM? Yeah, these are the things that you really need to think through, and the assessment allows you to make decisions about that, right? And then you can adjust your pricing either before or after the migration, so you're not pigeonholed in that the amount that it estimated is what it is. But the actuals when you get there are going to depend upon some other variables if you change things that was done in the assessment. Again, Microsoft funding is a big part of this. All right, next slide. You can, and we've seen with customers that we've worked with, we've seen cost reductions in these range. Now, remember, it's all based upon your future estimated on-premises costs, right? So you got to plug in what's the age of my hardware, what's my per hour rate, what's my cost for storage. You got to get all those things right. But we've seen from moving from an on-prem system, even if it's a partial move, anywhere from that 30 to 50% range. How long do assessments take? You really need at least 4 weeks to get good data. Could you do it with a little less? Yeah, but I wouldn't use that to go to the bank, right? To get funding from Microsoft. We need at least 30 days worth of data. A lot of people ask me why, because workloads can be burstable. You can have a process that runs at the end of the month. So that server just sits there with nothing to do and all get it done throughout the month. And then on the last 3 days of the month, that thing is cranking, right? You're going to want to have that in the assessment so it understands over time this machine needs to be burstable, or it needs to have scale up or scale down capabilities, and it'll add that in there. The tool costs nothing for Microsoft to install and get the appliance going, and to do everything I showed you today. It's all in your Azure subscription. I had actually a thing, but I didn't show it to you. It was like, here's all the resources that are in there. It's actually currently running at $0 per month. Until you start moving workloads and actually replicating and migrating, the assessment itself does not incur a bunch of Azure costs. Also, you can do a different Azure Migrate assessment per management group or per subscription, but not any lower than that. So if you've done a cloud adoption framework landing zone design, and you have, say, 4 landing zones, and your database landing zone is database, you can do an Azure Migrate assessment in that subscription for your database landing zone and put it all in there. You can also do it all in a single one. You don't have to necessarily break it up. The benefit to breaking it up is it actually accelerates the migration when you're ready to go. There's a lot of things that are going to drive this too. You got end of support timelines. 2012 R2 is getting ready to run out in October. 2016 is right after that. And on-premises costs are increasing. I saw an article where some guy was able to retrieve 128 gig of RAM, of DDR4 RAM out of the trash, and now sits on his own private island, right? Hardware costs are not going to go down, and they're not going to go in the right direction anytime soon. We don't want you to be doing a last-minute scramble and trying to secure funding. Oh, you got 4 weeks of your VMware and you don't want to renew it. Now, we've had customers go past the renewals. VMware doesn't just shut down and crash, but you do go into an unsupported state, which is undesirable. You can go past your VMware date. Hyper-V, pretty simple. There is no end date unless it's in the operating system, the version of Hyper-V you're running. Next one. And we'll wrap this up. So with ProArch, if you come to us, we're going to do a discovery workshop, understand your current workloads and business. We're going to crank up that assessment. 2 to 4 weeks, 2 is a minimum, 4 is preferred. And then we're going to help you generate all of those PowerPoints and all of those pieces, but we're also going to lay out a roadmap for you and help you say, okay, what would this cost if we did it ourselves? What would it cost if ProArch did it? And what would it cost if we did a better together approach? We do it better together, especially when you're starting to get into modernization, because that's where we actually shine. We can do modernization for a lot of these things based upon our capabilities. Unless you have a really small environment, you're absolutely going to be in a phased migration strategy. You're not going to be just ripping the Band-Aid and moving everything over. If you have just 3 or 4 or 10 machines, sure, that's totally possible. But Most people have more complex environments than that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a blessed day.
Bye-bye.